name's Alex Notay. I'm the Placemaking and Investment Director at PFP Capital. And we are a residential-led regeneration fund manager, and we are really passionate about ESG and social impacts in everything that we do. So I'm really delighted to be chairing this extremely expert panel, featuring Katherine Sherwin from BlackRock, Jon Lovell from Hillbrook, and Stuart Burrows from the Office of Government Property. We're going to have a really interactive discussion today around this hottest of hot topics. But please do engage and send us your questions. We'll try and weave them in through the session up to 1 o'clock that we have running today, along with my own. We, as an industry in real estate, we love our acronyms and we have a lot of jargon. And I think we're adding in here to the risk of word soup and confusion, because ESG is a term that's being thrown around with abandon at the moment, but perhaps not always with the same things in mind. So I'm looking forward to hearing from our expert panel about what they really mean by ESG and how we define it and what we then do with it in real estate, why we should bother, why we should care, and what we actually need to be doing. The Prime Minister, as many of you will have read this morning, wrote an article in the Financial Times about the green recovery. And although it didn't have a huge amount of detail around real estate particularly, I think there's a very clear head of steam behind how we're going to grow out of this pandemic crisis and beyond, on a train that was already very much around green recovery. But the Edelman Trust Barometer this morning came out questioning whether some investors felt that ESG was an expensive luxury to have during the pandemic. There was actually a much more nuanced debate in the session. I did attend it, but there's some interesting challenge around whether it is a tick box exercise or something you need to be seen to do, and where is the real value. Parallel to all of that, we have to acknowledge that buildings, existing buildings, are a huge contributor to global emissions. So the IEA, the International Energy Agency, runs an annual report on buildings and construction, and for 2019, buildings contributed to 40% of global emissions, and actually the building sector emissions rose by 2% from 2017 to 18 to a record high. So whilst we can all build a net zero new build test project, actually what we do with our existing portfolios is perhaps one of the greatest challenges for us as an industry. So that's a bit of the kind of framing that certainly the issues I'm trying to grapple with in my day job. I would love to hear from all our experts about what they're doing too, but yes, please engage through the questions. I'll keep an eye on those, and we'll have a good debate for the next 57 minutes. So I'm going to come first to Jon. Jon, you've been working in this space for a fair old while now, trying to help people navigate and understand. How do you define ESG?
How do I define it? Well, I define it in one way, and a million other people define it in a million other ways. And I think that's part of the challenge we face, because it does mean something different to everyone. And in one sense, that's quite right, because I'll explain in a moment what we mean by materiality. And that's a core concept at the heart of the ESG agenda. But I think if I was to kind of distill it into a nutshell, it would be to say, look, as society globally, we face all sorts of problems and challenges and threats, whether they are of a pure societal nature, whether they're environmental, whether they're economic, whatever they might be. So the question that organizations should be asking themselves is, are we making those problems and challenges worse as a result of how we run our businesses and manage our assets, etc.? Or are we actually contributing to alleviating those problems and coming up with the solutions to address them? So that's to me, that's what we're really getting to the heart of when we talk about ESG. So just on that point of materiality, which, as I say, is a fundamental concept. Clearly, not every organization, not every asset, not every fund can address all of those social and environmental and economic issues and factors. But it can and should be addressing those that are material to them and their performance as an organization or as an investment vehicle, whether that's from a pure financial perspective or whether it's more broadly. Now, of course, materiality is a dynamic kind of concept. It changes over time, and as market expectations change over time, so the different specific ESG factors that may or may not become material change. But it also has a double kind of meaning, in the sense that we need to think about materiality in two ways. One is, what are the external environmental and social and governance related factors that are impacting and will continue to impact upon our business, our fund, our portfolio? But also in reverse, what is the impact of our business and our portfolio on those external factors? So that kind of double dynamic is a really important feature. So that's how I would kind of conceptualize what we're talking about when we're speaking of ESG.
Okay, And I think just for kind of the real kind of break it down basic, environmental tends to be the one that lots of people have really focused on, sustainability policy and metrics and benchmarks and certifications. There's been a huge proliferation of those. Could you just talk a little bit about that, and then the evolution into kind of more focus I think we're seeing now on the S around social impact and social value?
Yeah, so it's the trend over time and the dynamics over time have been really quite interesting. So as you mentioned at the outset, I've kind of been at this game for quite a period of time now, and ESG as an agenda has developed and grown out and expanded from the traditional kind of focus on sustainability issues, which continue to be, urgent imperatives, but which now wraps in a broader array of issues as well. So you're right. One might argue that the environmental pillar of ESG is more mature, more established, and that's partly a function of the fact that it's relatively easier to define and measure, so we can track progress towards environmental goals in a slightly more straightforward way than we can on the social side of things, which remains quite very nuanced, really. And our ways of measuring what we mean by social kind of ESG factors is still developing at a pace, but that pace is really quick, and the social is definitely catching up with the environmental. On the governance side of things, clearly many of our audience today will be very familiar with traditional features and aspects of governance, particularly those that have a sort of compliance lens associated with them. But in the kind of the new world of ESG, governance means so much more than that, and it's become a much more additive concept about purpose and culture and values and accountability and transparency, and how do we, through the chain of our internally within our organization, but across the whole of the value chain that we work with, how do we address those environmental and social imperatives together?
Thank you. And that purpose point, I think, is something we'll come back with, because around activist shareholders and that real pressure on expectation, on recruiting talent and people who are actively avoiding companies that they don't feel align with their values. I think there's a really interesting mix in that space too. Thanks, Jon. Katherine, I want to come to you. BlackRock, I cite Larry Fink in almost all of my presentations in his letter to shareholders in 2018, talking about it's no longer enough just to generate shareholder return. And clearly, the world's largest asset manager has been a real pioneer in this space. But what has it taken for you as an organization to move ESG from being a kind of a tick box, nice to have, to being embedded in your strategy? Could you take us through that, please?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the things to stress from the offset is we're very fortunate within BlackRock to have a global executive committee that is incredibly focused on advancing sustainable investing. And we really see that getting cascaded down to our real estate platform in a very determined way. And I think, the reason why our organization has really pivoted our approach is really because we truly believe that actually, from an investment perspective, thinking about ESG material considerations is actually a core element of driving financial performance for our clients. And I suppose when we think about this and when we talk about this messaging, and this has been something that's been a belief for many years, but we've seen obviously go more mainstream, part of the realization that actually you're integrating ESG considerations within your investment processes, you are not sacrificing returns, which was a misconception that existed for many years. And really, we're now seeing the benefit that actually, if you get this right, you are protecting and if not enhancing your returns. And I think in the context of real estate, this is especially important because we are long-term investors. And, these are liquid funds that we're building out, and we're deploying our clients' capital over a long period of time. And Jon alluded to it just then in terms of this is a very dynamic space when we think about ESG. It is rapidly evolving. It's going to evolve even further and get bigger as an agenda over many years. So really, as an investment house, we just think this should be a good part of investing. It makes us good fiduciary investors. So first off, it's not a feel-good factor. This is not around kind of values versus value. Essentially, we believe there is value in getting this right. But ultimately, if you think about BlackRock's roots, we are a firm that is being built around risk management. And ultimately, going back to some of those early points I just made, we feel that actually ESG risk, including climate risk, is investment risk, and ultimately is about good risk management, understanding both, if you take climate change, for example, and in the context of real estate, this is so relevant, thinking about what those transition risks are with regards to emerging legislation, energy transition, which I know we'll touch on as well, but also physical risk. We invest in physical assets. In many ways, our investments are going to be at the forefront of physical climatic changes. So thinking about that is actually just core to our approach to, valuing our investments based upon what those potential risks, as well as opportunities actually could be. But I think interestingly, there's also a realization that actually ESG can provide a source of alpha. And certainly we feel that there are going to be significant investment opportunities in this space. Sustainable real estate is certainly one of them. If I take it at a higher level now, we hear these numbers being thrown around about what the energy transition investment opportunity space looks like. And, these are in the tens of trillions of dollars as kind of the sector as a whole wakes up to the fact that this is an increasingly important agenda and something that is critical in terms of enhancing returns over time. And I think what's really interesting is when you talk about that point around the built environment being accountable for 40% of greenhouse gas emissions. When we think about what that decarbonisation opportunity set looks like, the built environment has to play a critical role in that. It not only has to play a critical role in meeting some of these targets and these objectives that we set, like the Paris Agreement and net zero, which will come on, but it's got to play a critical role in terms of how that investment opportunity set evolves over time. So this has really kind of become a key part of the DNA at BlackRock. And to be honest, I think real estate was actually probably part of the firm that we were thinking about this for longer. And we were really kind of one of the parts of the businesses that was flying the ESG flag for much longer. And really, this was not around marketing. This was really down to a conviction that we invest in physical assets, in local environments, in local communities. We have to get ESG right. We're holding some of these investments for 15, 20 years. These factors, they're material, they're important, and they're going to drive and protect value. So it is part of the DNA. And it's something that I'm super excited to see evolve and accelerate over time as well.
Fantastic. Thank you, Katherine. There's loads of great points I want to come back to in there, but particularly on how you therefore choose to benchmark and manage and monitor that information. I think we talked a little bit before about the plethora of certifications. How did you guys decide on what sort of formats you use, particularly around the environmental side, which, as Jon alluded to, is slightly more advanced in those metrics?
And I think this is one of those areas where as a fund manager, we have a bottom-up approach and we have a top-down approach. And so when we think about what that bottom approach looks like, and this really feeds into some of the points that Jon was making in terms of materiality, this is especially true when we're looking at investments. ESG considerations are made on an asset-by-asset basis. And there are clear examples of where we can drive tremendous value through targeting improved sustainability performance at an asset level. And that's where we can fold in standards such as green building certifications, BREEAM, LEED, neighbours, dependent on geography, dependent on strategy. Obviously, BREEAM here in the UK is the leading one. So a lot of this really plays into our role as being an active asset manager, and how post-transaction can we continue to drive improvements in sustainability performance. Now, in some areas, and maybe this is determined by tenant type or property type, this is an easier win. An example would be if you're investing in prime office, actually as part of that argument for tenant attraction and maintaining value over time is going to be thinking about the sustainability performance of that specific investment and thinking about BREEAM excellence as an example of providing a robust framework to target improvements going forward. If you're thinking about investing in logistics in the Northeast, maybe there isn't such a value for certification. And so it really is an asset by asset basis. But ultimately, when we then think about what that top down looks like, and actually reporting at a portfolio level, which is really where our clients are most interested, it obviously starts at the asset level. You've got to drive individual asset level performance to drive those aggregated portfolio level improvements over time. But we have lent very heavily into GRESB as a benchmark, which we do believe has emerged as the leading sustainability benchmark for the real estate sector. And this is something that we commit to every year in terms of reporting. We actually did 21 submissions this year, so it is quite a task in terms of actually reporting all of our portfolios into that. But this is something that has really become increasingly important within our investment universe, certainly here in Europe. To make a bold statement, we wouldn't actually be able to effectively capital raise for new funds or for open-ended portfolios unless we were participating in GRES, unless we were demonstrating improved performance in the benchmark over time. So this is really something that has shaped the industry. We've seen it shape the industry because we've seen the benchmark as a whole evolve over time. It's becoming much more performance focused, i.e. what is the environmental performance of your underlying assets? It's moving away from management and policy and reporting, and it's really going to be a tool that I think we can use to drive the sector going forward, but I'm sure we'll touch on it in the webinar today. All of that is underpinned by greater visibility on data and actually what is happening within your properties, within your portfolio, and where are they with regards to energy consumption, greenhouse gas emissions, water consumption, etc.
Alex, can I just chip in on because I'm really conscious that Stuart hasn't had a chance to speak yet, but I think there's just a really important point that Katherine's just alluded to in what she said, that it's great, it's fantastic that Katherine's brought the conversation straight away down into a very practical kind of asset focused kind of type of conversation. And of course, focusing on opportunities and interventions that make sense at the asset level is absolutely, the core of what we should be thinking about. What she's also mentioned, though, is that investors and clients are asking for this kind of top-down reporting and disclosure through tools such as GRES. And we do have, in my view, a very genuine issue in the market at the moment with a degree of tension between those two things, because by default, benchmarking systems that are trying to apply a homogeneous set of criteria across what is a very heterogeneous asset class are forcing people. It's like the tail is beginning to wag the dog. So people are having to address portfolio level indicators in order to satisfy those reporting requirements, because they do make a difference in terms of capital allocations, no question about that. But that might not actually make any sense on the ground when it comes to the circumstances of a particular asset.
And actually that can really lose you goodwill of not only your asset managers, but also your tenants, because if you're driving a requirement for something that is just illogical and that can be kind of relation to the asset and the way it's used, that just to get the tick in the reporting box, that can be really unfortunate. We'll definitely come back to that. Thank you, Jon. So Stuart, I wanted to come to you, as we alluded to the Prime Minister's article this morning, this huge push that we already were well aware in policy terms around net zero, but in your role with the Office of Government Property and a vast estate there of existing building stock of varying types, what are you doing at OGP to kind of move us along in this space?
Yeah, thanks, Alex. And lots of interesting points raised all round. It's hard to kind of know where to address first. But I guess on your particular question of what the Office of Government Property are doing at the moment, what government are doing more broadly, I think particularly in my team and particularly at the moment, there's a clear focus on the environmental elements of what we've covered already, and largely among that, but largely on decarbonisation and net zero, but not just limited to that side of things. Clearly, I guess ESG has been embedded in the core principles of government for quite some time. Well, forever ultimately. So it's not really a concept that we use very much and that we talk of, but it's absolutely embedded in our principles of how we operate and why many of us were drawn to working for government initially. You asked, Alex, I think about the work that we're doing in particular at the moment, and the programme of work that I'm leading on and working on at the moment is focused on leading and coordinating activity across the government estate to drive a step change in our journey towards net zero. And largely, I guess, we're using the term a well-maintained net zero estate. So making sure to improve the condition of our estate, which is part and parcel of the journey towards net zero. When we're talking of government estate, in our terms, that's over 300,000 buildings. So a huge amount, a huge portfolio for us to be able to coordinate. There are different estates teams within different departments that are driving forward that work. But our role in the centre is to help to coordinate that and to bring some consistency and to help equip different departments with the tools to make their lives easier in doing that. I guess some of the work that we've been doing in that respect has been around implementing standards, bringing some consistent standards that can be implemented across government in respect of net zero and sustainability. helping in develop tools to help departments to predict their trajectory towards net zero and the investment that will be required to do that. Putting in place systems for data and evidence. I think Katherine and others were mentioning the difficulties of baselining and of establishing the data position. And also a real focus around building capability and capacity across government to deliver what we need to do. This is clearly a developing area, and there's a need for a lot of training and investment in capability across government and elsewhere to do that. I think it's clear that there's a shortage of expertise across the market, and prices are going up effectively as a result of that. So sorry, I'll stop there for a moment, but yeah, a few of the points we're doing.
And I think that point about consistency is something I'd like to come back to. And I can see a couple of questions coming in, so that's great. Please keep them coming. I will come to those shortly. But Stuart, I also wanted to ask you about UK role in the COP, in hosting that. I think first, if you could define what that is for those of our attendees who aren't familiar with it, but also what we hope to get out of it.
Yeah, so I can speak of what I know of it. I should say I'm not speaking as the authority on the COP or anyone who's actually leading on that. There's other teams within government who are leading that area. But yeah, in November of next year, the UK will be hosting the COP26 Climate Summit. It's an opportunity where we're bringing together world leaders to discuss their commitments in relation to climate change and greenhouse gas emissions. And I think, broadly speaking, if I was trying to summarise, I guess the opportunity is to try and raise the ambition of all of those countries' targets in relation to climate change, in relation to greenhouse gas emissions. And at that point, UK government will be giving an update on their position in relation to those areas. And key to that, I think, will be our position on the net zero commitment for 2050, updating on progress against that and what plans we have next in that respect. I think you mentioned earlier, Alex, about the announcements that have been made today by the Prime Minister. I've not managed to get into the detail of all of those yet, but certainly in relation to government property and broader property, there were certainly commitments for further investment, which follows on the back of a good deal of investment that's been put certainly in the public sector estate and in residential, in the green homes grants over the last year. I think there's a further £1 billion that's been committed for the year ahead, to be split across public sector and residential. And so I think that was the key bits that came from that.
Great, thank you. And then I just want to ask Jon and Katherine, in that kind of policy drive and the kind of the carrots and sticks that kind of Stuart's alluded to, and that we've seen in kind of various elements of particularly carbon focus, but now net zero targets and baselining. There's also been a great deal of leadership from various institutions. So BP, the UK's largest pension fund, has set a very ambitious net zero target for themselves. How are you seeing that dynamic between, the policy being the lead driver for this and actually sort of investor stroke shareholder demand pushing it? Have you seen that change, or do you think it's equal, Jon?
Massively change. And if I sort of cast my mind back to working in this sort of space, 5, 6, 7, 8, even 10 years ago, it was predominantly a compliance-led agenda. It was predominantly about what regulation is coming down the track that we need to be ready for, and clients would typically ask us, how do we comply with regulation X in the most cost-effective way, in the most timely way. That was typically where conversations started. That then evolved very significantly. There was partly a post-GFC kind of effect in terms of businesses and corporates increasingly beginning to understand that they had an important role in society, needed to kind of stake a bit more of a leadership position and a responsible business position in that regard. But it swung into, in my mind, a very strongly investor-driven agenda. And I think that has been predominantly where we've been over the last 3 or 4 years. And the kind of That's not to say that every investor is on the journey and that every investor is on the same point of the maturity curve. Absolutely not. And that in itself poses a real challenge for asset managers. But the policy and regulatory side of things has really swung back in again, I think, over the last year or so. Now, a lot of that is focused on Europe and what's coming out of Europe, especially around disclosures and non-financial reporting and how one defines sustainability or impact or green in the context of financial products and assets and services. So we've now got, I think, those two, not competing interests at all, but those two very strong parallel drivers, coupled with a greater, you mentioned right at the outset, Alex, I think this increase in public activism, I wouldn't ignore at all, and I wouldn't underestimate how much of an effect that is having in the minds of non-execs and on the minds of exec committees. That's been a real feature of discussions that we've been having at that level over the last 12 months or so.
Thanks. Katherine, this sort of ties back to the point you made about it being a risk assessment, risk and resilience, and could you just comment on that and the kind of, you mentioned in our prep call about ESG actually being mispriced often in your view?
Yeah, absolutely. And first, just really echoing some of the comments that Jon was making then, we really are seeing kind of the investors driving this agenda forward at a much faster rate. Now, that might change as policy catches up. And we've seen some big statements coming out, the fact that China has committed to net zero by 2060. I think we're going to see policy accelerate in this area. But actually, if anything, that's probably just going to further amplify the focus that both institutional and financial investors are having on this agenda. So I completely agree. The business world has overtaken the policy makers at this point in time. But going back to kind of the pricing, I think this is one of the challenges that we have within the sector as a whole, and there's multiple challenges to this. And I completely agree with you. You hear about the kind of the UK's agenda on meeting net zero, and we talk about it being technically feasible but highly challenging, and I think that resonates with a lot of what we do on sustainable investing in real estate. But I think one of the biggest challenges for us as a whole is this concept of pricing, and this is very much a personal view, although I do think it is shared more broadly by many in the sector, which is just that ESG risks, and especially climatic risk, actually is just not effectively being priced into real estate. This is a global issue. There isn't the golden key yet to this, but I think there will be a rebalance over time, and that could either be a transitional rebalance or it could be something that is pretty swift in the market. And when I talk about pricing, I really mean within the capital values of real estate, but I also mean in the case of insurance as well. A prime example is I don't think insurance is really pricing in, let's take physical climate risk as example, sea level rise, flood risk, extreme weather events, those kind of factors, which actually we have to think about the resilience of our real estate against those kind of changing factors. And I just don't think this is something that's effectively been priced in. Now, as long-term investors, that makes our job a little bit more challenging in terms of working out what those risk returns are, in terms of now kind of trying to consider what those returns for our clients are. And we can do as much pricing into our own due diligence processes as possible, but we also have to remain competitive as well. So this really is something that has to be a sector-wide shift in mindset. And interestingly, I think that's started to happen a little bit. We're seeing, again, I talk about bottom up and top down, but we're seeing this kind of concept of a brown discount being applied more than maybe a green premium. So essentially, those, and here in the UK, when the MIS legislation came out, the minimum energy efficiency standards came out, and we saw kind of tighter regulation on what EPC ratings can be and the ability in a landlord to potentially lease a property based on EPC ratings. This is going to generate real, risk of stranded assets and asset obsolescence. There's going to be, maybe a chunk of about 15% of the UK commercial real estate, which is at an FLG rated EPC and cannot be less, and therefore the value of that will decline over time. So these things are starting to influence pricing, and that's shaped our house views in terms of EPC ratings when we're making acquisitions. There's got to be a business case of CapEx. Can we get that up to a standard? What is the energy efficiency potential of this investment? So these themes are certainly coming in, but it's something that is moving at quite a slow rate. I do think there needs to be a rebalance over time, and would welcome views on anyone else on the panel if this is something that they also think is maybe a sector-wide issue, and would also welcome views on how we challenge it, because I don't think we're quite there yet.
Okay. Thanks, Katherine. I think there's some ULI research wearing a ULI hat that Jon and I both was on the kind of impact of extreme weather events. And actually it was very much that Superstorm Sandy kind of drove a real sort of wake up call for a number of major real estate players and actually the global insurance market. But you're right, I think there's definitely a way to go. I can see a ton of questions coming through, so I'm just going to try and aggregate them around themes. But a number of our participants are asking around the S in ESG, and particularly, Jon, you alluded to that this is something that's sometimes a bit harder to measure, can be a risk of kind of slightly patronizing. Sometimes there's a gentrification elements to it as well. That we know that there are some, in kind of the social housing space, there are a number of standards. There's scores like HACT, and Big Society Capital and the Good Economy are trying to come out with some stuff that's particularly around ESG for social housing. But how do you see the clients that you work with tackling the S in ESG? And then Stuart, I'll come to you on a kind of policy angle.
In a very rapidly evolving way is the frank answer to that. And I think, you know, there's two, they're not mutually exclusive, but there's two predominant schools of thought in this space as far as I can read at the moment. One is that we try and measure social impact with reference to real world measurable outcomes. So, you know, how many people's livelihoods have been improved as a result of the interventions that we've made? What are those interventions and what is the nature of that improvement? And how have those stakeholders, those beneficiaries, if you like, how do they perceive the effect of those changes for good or otherwise? So that really kind of, that's kind of at the heart really of the impact kind of concept from an investment style point of view. The other is to try and measure in a monetized sense social value or the social return on investment, and I think both have a place. My concern with the monetization of social value is that that's potentially being overstated and overplayed and overused. And I would kind of, if I was to use an analogy, I'd sort of think of it as a child's paint pot with, you know, half a dozen different colors in it. But once you mix them all together, you just end up with like a brown smudge that doesn't really look like very much at all. And my concern is that by trying to come up with a single monetized figure of social value and communicating that to a range of different audiences, it becomes quite meaningless to a number of those audiences. Now, I understand that, you know, in terms of making the case for a development project at the local level, for example, there's a role for it in that context. I understand that investors want to try and put a broader economic number on the social utility of their investments, but I think to focus too far in on that as a sort of standalone metric is quite dangerous.
Mm-hmm. Stuart, how are you approaching the S of ESG within OGP?
Yeah, so I think particular area to reference is around the supply chain and procurement side of things. Mm-hmm. I think not just with OGP, but OGP working with government commercial and other areas, Crown Commercial Service. There's been a lot of work on guidance for procurement and actually helping to equip those out in the private sector to understand better what government are seeking in this area. And social value playing a huge part in that. There's work both underway and complete on some playbooks that are being developed. I think the outsourcing playbook has been published now, but there's a construction playbook that is in development and that's been developed in consultation with private sector, really just to spell out more what government are seeking in this area, and really to make it clear to those bidding for work in the public sector that, you know, social value plays a huge part in decision making alongside a number of other factors, but that it's a key part of the decision making process in bringing people on board.
And that oversight of the supply chain thing is actually something we've seen a number of corporate entities go corporate with, actually not having a true understanding of what's happening further down the chain. Katherine, there've been a number of questions that's sort of asking you to elaborate a bit more on how BlackRock approaches the S of social value.
Yeah, and this is something that actually interesting we've been thinking about for some time, but we've really seen amplified by the pandemic this year. And a lot of these kind of social themes really come under a much stronger spotlight. And really along that spectrum, they've ranged from how are we driving social impact with our investment decision making and actually where we're choosing to allocate capital, to what are we doing on kind of occupier health and well-being, indoor air quality as an example. So this is kind of a very varied spectrum, you know, and again, is complex. I think one of the challenges we have as we navigate what, you know, increased integration of S within ESG looks like is we can't rely on the metrics in the same way we can for any environmental consideration. So if you take a property and you're thinking about environmental impact of that property, you have the utilities to lean into. You have energy consumption, greenhouse gas emissions, water consumption, waste management, even biodiversity metrics if you're really thinking quite holistic on environmental. And you can use that to understand what the environmental impact of any given investment is. It's much harder when it comes to social. It's much harder to understand, you know, the community impact that investment is having. It's much harder to demonstrate how that investment is interacting with the community. Is it driving value? Is it driving too much value? Is it generating gentrification, whatever it might be? And if I take a clear example from one of our portfolios, so we have a large UK core portfolio. We have 65 primary healthcare investments within that portfolio. So these are general practices, doctor surgeries, located across the UK, many of them in rural, remote locations that are providing critical healthcare access to often rural, remote communities. So we know that they're having a positive impact, but it's really hard for us to demonstrate what that impact is. And even actually getting underlying raw data on patients served and things like that is really hard. And actually, this is something that we're partnering with our infrastructure teams on at the moment in terms of what does social impact look like. And they've done quite a lot of work bridging impacts to UN SDGs and things like that, which is something that we're going to lean into in a much more determined way. So when I think about what our 2021 sustainable investing strategy looks like, there are really two key areas that we are leaning into in a very determined way. The first is how can we accelerate social impact collation, reporting, disclosure, and ultimately use that information to be informing our investment decision making. And then the other one is net zero. I know those themes we've already touched on today. So it is something that we're thinking about in a very, very much more determined way. But it is something that we're still waiting for an element of standardization around what are the metrics that we should be collating, what are the metrics we should be reporting, how can that be informing investment decision making, how can it be informing even disposal activity, etc.
I think that's a really important observation, and I'd characterise the space, if you like, as being in sort of creative chaos, which is an accusation you could throw at all manner of aspects of this agenda in the market at the moment. But from a social impact point of view, in particular, you know, we spend quite a lot of time helping clients with their impact strategies, whether that's for new products or to kind of retro engineer across their existing kind of portfolios. And one of the fairly obvious realizations that comes about as a result of that, before we even get to kind of industry standardization of reporting and disclosure and measurement around it, and the participation in industry kind of platforms to seek that better standardization, I think is an important activity. But more important than that is helping clients realize from an asset management point of view that they need to be more engaged in a local community from a place-based point of view, really understanding what local place-based needs are and how their investment, how their asset management can help to address those. And the only way they can do that is by dialogue, by engagement with local people. And, you know, we're starting to see from a product development side of things, from a fund governance point of view, people starting to focus on actually sort of place-based boards or committees or whatever you want to call them. I hate the term, but as part of the governance structure for a fund to really plug that local intelligence, that local dialogue and engagement into the process.
We're going to come back to governance because there's been a couple of great questions about how you actually measure that, Katherine, particularly because GRESB doesn't necessarily include measures on that. So great if you could think on that. But I want to touch here on that fit for purpose nature of reporting and the push for standardization across real estate, when partly Stuart alluded to a lot of the measures announced this morning relating to residential. Actually, in terms of my world is all residential, and we are a long way behind commercial real estate in being able to grapple with ESG. We have complexities around the very granular nature of residential portfolios, around, you know, tenants, and when it's people's homes, you have much less leverage and influence over people, you know, what people do around both energy and water and waste, but other elements in their homes. So actually, one of the things that I'm doing with the BPF is we have a working group and we're running on residential and ESG, and we'd be really keen for anyone who wishes to come engage with us on that. We've got some great work happening there. But, you know, Jon, where are you seeing your clients, and I know you work with us, but obviously other clients, the evolution of residential as a commercial asset class is relatively new, but, you know, with that is coming investor expectation. What are some of the challenges and opportunities around how we tackle ESG within Resi?
Within Resi specifically, I think, well, there's a couple of contextual prerequisites, I suppose. One is that the institutionalization of that part of our sector is at a more infant stage. So there's less depth of expertise typically embedded in organizations that are focused on that sector. The other side of the equation is that there is a lazy assumption that because we invest in Resi, we're investing in a social good, or we're managing assets that have a social utility. Therefore, we tick the kind of the right box from a social and societal perspective. So those are two things that subsector, if you like, needs to challenge in and of itself. Now, the disclosure and reporting space is really complex, but by virtue of the number of different standards and frameworks that are out there, the way in which they do or don't overlap and or harmonize, a lot of this is going to be resolved through regulation to some extent. So what's happening in Europe at the moment with the sustainability related financial disclosure regulations in particular, and the EU taxonomy to an extent, are going to, I think a number of people think that's going to create the new de facto standard for ESG disclosure in an asset management context, irrespective of asset class. Now, one of the challenges with that is that at the moment, the standards that are being developed in that space are absolutely not fit for purpose in an alternatives context generally, let alone a subsector of a particular asset class. So there's a huge way to go in that regard to better define the requirements. But the effect that that's having in the broader market has been really interesting. And if you look at all of the international sort of global custodians of the ESG reporting standards and frameworks, they have since publicly stated that they're going to work together on harmonization and consolidation, because they've realized, as a result of the proliferation that they've been contributing to, they've become not irrelevant, but not fit for purpose when, you know, we have so many jurisdictional inputs from an investment point of view, so many different types of investor trying to, or capital providers generally, you know, lenders are as important in this space as well now, trying to access the space. So from an individual kind of property company or housing association or fund manager point of view, that creates a really bewildering array of kind of issues to try and have to wrestle with and tackle. You're right to point out that, you know, there are new standards that are more specific to that space that have come forward. I think the work that the Good Economy have done with that, with the standard for housing associations, is a really significant step in the right direction. Do I think it absolutely nails it? No, I don't. I think there's still, and you know, they've set out a kind of governance approach to making sure that evolves over time. I come back to where I started right at the beginning. Yes, there are important considerations to bear in mind in terms of the way in which data is collected and reported. But the fundamental point comes back to that materiality principle. What matters to the portfolio that you own and or manage? What matters to the residents that occupy it? How does that drive what you do from a strategy perspective, from a risk management perspective, from an outcomes and impact perspective, and make sure that the focus of your both narrative and quantitative reporting is focused on those issues. If that means that you're not optimizing your performance under one particular benchmarking system or otherwise, I accept that there are implications related to that because of the blindness with which a number of market participants use them. But be transparent and open and engage with those, you know, whether it's investors or lenders, help them understand why that doesn't work and isn't applicable for your particular entity or portfolio. And
I think that point, Jon, really answers about some of the questions we're having coming through about, you know, what people can do with existing portfolios of older assets where ESG risks are identified but would require such substantial capital investment to address. And I think, you know, that challenge when you present a huge number to a board who go, well, we can't possibly do that. And it seems overwhelming. So actually what you're advising is just really to zero in on almost that kind of, as well as the top down, that asset by asset approach to what's appropriate. That materiality is so key.
Yeah, absolutely. And on that question, you know, it's not uncommon for us to finish a session with a board or an exec committee or group of fund managers, and at the end of it, they go, we just feel totally underwhelmed. And part of us feels guilty for, you know, leaving them with that sense. But there is, you know, if I'm to be really candid about this, I think that, you know, people have to recognize that they've been asleep at the wheel for quite a long time. And the reason that some of this stuff is becoming so daunting for them now is because they've ignored it for too long. You know, the signals have been there. This isn't new, right? This is not a kind of, it's grown up quite quickly recently, but this is not a new concept. It's not a new set of issues. So I think that there's partly, and I know that's not a very helpful comment to make, but I think it's a true, a reasonable one. So if there is a big number, a big problem, try as far as you can to break it down into its constituent parts. Don't necessarily think in the same ways as you might historically have done so about how solving that problem might be financed. There are all sorts of innovative solutions out there now, all sorts of differentiated financial products in the market that are trying to step in. You know, it's a cliche, but the amount of capital that is trying to align itself with these sorts of solutions and outcomes and opportunities is vast. Making sure that you position the proposition in the right way to attract that capital can really unlock opportunities that you never realized existed.
Absolutely. And that innovation with bodies like Nesta, we're seeing, I mean, there's a great question here around, is one of the risks to ESG performance our new work from home culture, where everyone's boilers and lights are running throughout the winter and far more inefficient than some commercial premises? You know, one of the things we've been talking a lot about air quality, and, you know, you can have an air quality monitor on your phone, and people are becoming much more alive to the role of the, you know, the building that they're in for an awful lot longer than they might have been before. Stuart, is that something that you're kind of seeing and adapting to kind of work from home across your estate, and what that might mean for the transition you're making with net zero?
Yeah, I think certainly we've, well, as with all other areas, all other office areas, we've seen a huge, well, even before COVID, we were actively decreasing our footprint and actively encouraging flexible, smarter working. So yeah, we've seen a huge change in that. It's hard, as for everybody, it's hard to know what direction that will go in the future, other than to know that, you know, our plan as government in terms of our office estate is to continue to reduce our footprint and to bring efficiencies to what we're doing with each of the buildings, and to continue with the smarter working culture as much as we can. I think that's alongside, you know, particularly also decreasing the footprint in London and moving out to the regions where, well, both to help stimulate economic growth in the regions, but to you know, to reduce our footprint in just one place, zone 1 of London. So yeah, you mentioned, and there's also a few questions.
Oh, go on, Stuart.
I was just going to say about, you were mentioning also about the challenges previously and reflecting on some of Jon's points. I think certainly the kind of the where to start and what to prioritise first is one of the key issues that I think all of us are grappling with at the moment. And I guess the approach that we're taking with this a lot, where there are choices to be made, is actually trying to align certainly changes in decarbonisation alongside life cycle replacement, and looking at opportunities to just need to pay the delta of the difference each time, rather than the huge investment of decarbonisation on its own.
Yeah, and not turning too controversial, but there's a number of questions around offsetting and the role of offsetting in hitting net zero. Have you got a view on that?
Not a personal view, and it's something that's being developed by colleagues over at DEFRA, Department for Environment, and at BEIS. But certainly, you know, biodiversity and offsetting, they're huge opportunities for us. They're areas that we are alive to and looking at. Certainly, again, when we talk about the government estate, there is a huge amount of land contained within that, particularly for, you know, the defence estate, Department for Environment, that includes all the forests and things. So yeah, huge opportunities for offsetting with that, you know, alongside some of the announcements that were made today, I think, by the Prime Minister around new technologies, carbon capture, and other areas. So, yeah, I don't have a personal position on it, but there's major opportunities.
Jon, I know we could go off in a bit of a tangent about offsetting, but Katherine, I wanted to come back to you on that governance question that a few participants have asked. So how do you measure, monitor that within BlackRock?
So the governance position?
Yeah.
Well, yeah, so I mean, this varies. I mean, is this a question relating to kind of our own governance, or
how do you assess or benchmark corporate governance, as GRESB does not include this? We know that strong, independent and diverse oversight and general ESG competence at a board level is still greatly lacking globally. On the road to net zero, the role of boards will be imperative. So what should asset managers be demanding from real estate companies in this regard? Quite a detailed question, but just the kind of...
Yeah, and I mean, this, I suppose, is probably a relation more to kind of the listed side, the security side of our investment activities. And what I would say is, when we're doing due diligence on that side of the platform and actually investing into underlying portfolio companies, that corporate governance and how governance is structured within an organization is something very detailed, but we actually do that due diligence ourselves. And that is because we don't have necessarily the frameworks or the industry standard practice to lean into. That due diligence is kind of quite a heavy lift exercise. There's the questionnaires that go out to the underlying portfolio companies to get a sense of, you know, everything relating to corporate governance, but also other governance factors such as bribery and corruption and cyber technology, diversity and inclusion, you know, all these factors that are increasingly important. And ultimately, we take a view that, you know, this is critical, and this is something that within our own company, we're throwing a lot of thought behind this in terms of how do we get our own governance right, and how does that cascade down to all of our investment strategies. But this is something that quite rightly is not yet captured within GRESB, apart from at a high level policy level. And as we know, there is a big disconnect between policies existing and actually then getting implemented in a practical way, and you're seeing change kind of getting driven out throughout an organization. So this is something that, you know, we're thinking about in terms of on the listed side of the business for sure. And, you know, we have dismissed deals or investment opportunities because we could not get comfortable with certain governance factors, and that might be kind of historical factors that we don't believe have been fully rectified yet. We don't believe that their plans of progression are ambitious enough or kind of forward-thinking enough. So this is something to influencing the allocation of capital across the securities business. Across the equity and debt side, it's a little bit different because we're the direct owner in those investments too. So ultimately, it's our own governance considerations that are kind of probably most important. But the other area that falls under that umbrella is obviously who we choose to partner with. And that might be joint ventures, it might be vendors, it might be property managers that we bring on board. And obviously that we do due diligence on all of those partners with us as well. And really, you know, who we're going into partnership with on any given investment, we've got to be comfortable with those kind of arrangements from an ESG perspective as well, because ultimately, you know, that is going to lead to the success of any given investment opportunity too.
Thank you, Katherine. And I think I'm very conscious we've talked a lot about, you know, big institutions and policy levers, but actually for those BPF members who may be kind of more SME businesses and being sort of slightly overwhelmed by this. And I think this comes back to, you know, what I mentioned just at the beginning of this session, that Edelman study that I know has come up, you know, 89% of investors thinking that ESG is a luxury consideration or secondary. And I actually attended the webinar this morning and it was a little more nuanced in the debate of the results, but one of the things that was interesting was that they said that 63% of UK investors were actively screening out, as exactly as you say, companies that failed on things like diversity and inclusion because they would see that as a future problem. But you know, when we're talking about, you know, having the scale that clearly BlackRock has a scale platform, Stuart, you have a vast kind of portfolio to address. Jon, for members who are trying to grapple with ESG but have a, you know, either a smaller part to play in terms of that they only deal with maybe construction or design or operation, or that they have a smaller portfolio. Yeah. What's your advice?
So my first remark would be to have sympathy with that position, because, you know, there is just a hard and fast reality to the fact that focusing on this type of subject matter requires a degree of dedicated resource. And I'm the first to challenge a number of our clients when I think they're under-resourcing it, because I think it's become of such significance to their future kind of relevance and performance, that it requires that level of dedication. I think the starting point is to understand what is the position of your organization in the context of the market ecosystem, if you like. And it's all very well saying, larger institutions have the resource, have the capacity, this, that, and the other. But actually, I think it's incumbent upon those larger institutions and companies, through their own governance approach and through understanding that you need alignment of purpose, objectives, incentives, rewards, risks throughout that whole value chain, that it's important to help take those smaller organizations who will inevitably be part of your value chain with you on that journey. So I do think there's a broader kind of a collective good that has a sort of a private benefit, if you like, from doing it well. So, if you're in a smaller firm, I would suggest openly engage with those upstream and downstream of you to understand what their approaches and priorities are, and to respond accordingly to that. I think that's a good point of principle to start from.
Thank you. And Katherine, there was a question at the beginning that I meant to ask you around any technology leaders emerging to support, the very crowded field of benchmarks and certifications. But, we talk a lot about prop tech, and you've mentioned that the very heavy burden of reporting on your teams. And is there the potential for technology solutions to ease that? Or at the moment, is it still so granular that it just needs sort of person power?
Yeah, it's a little bit of both. And I think, technology is going to play a huge role in reporting and disclosure and benchmarking going forward, because ultimately that whole process is underpinned by data. And this concept of it is the underlying data at an asset level that informs what that benchmarking looks like. So really, when we're looking into kind of what technology can assist us, it is at that granular property level data collation, and that folds into bigger discussions around building management system optimization, smart metering, ensuring we have AMR rollout across our estates. But ultimately, that's where the focus is at the moment on technology and advancements. I suppose at the other end of the scale, and going back to the comments on offsetting, technology will play a role in that for sure. And, but ultimately, before we get to offsetting, and that really we view that as kind of the last choice or the last step in net zero. It's got to come after measurement, reduction, increasing efficiency, renewable energy procurement, etc. It does play a role, but it is that last step. And ultimately, when you think about that, it's all data. It's got to be technology to streamline that, but ensure kind of accuracy and completeness. What I would say is, no matter how advanced the technology gets, there's going to be an element of human resource that's required for sense checking of this and for quality checking of this. So I don't think that reporting burden is going to disappear over the next 2 to 3 years. What I would love to see to actually streamline that reporting burden is more of a standardization and more of alignment between frameworks. I mean, if I think about what we've done this year, in addition to GRES, which quite frankly is almost a full-time 2-month exercise with the 21 submissions that we do. We've had SASB, we've had TCFD, we've got all of our annual reporting we do, we have our client quarterly reporting that we do, we have got UNPRI, we're thinking about science-based reduction targets, this reporting burden is huge, and ultimately it's all informed by property level data. So that's where the technology will assist us ultimately.
Yeah. Super, thank you. We're into our last couple of minutes, so I'd just like to ask each of you to think of any, the question I think that was posed to us by James, who's running this fantastic work, is if you could change 3 things now to enhance ESG outcomes in real estate, what would they be? But they'll have to be either 3 very quick things or 1 thing. But I think we've highlighted some fantastic key points around. Jon, you talked about materiality, and actually just for everyone being overwhelmed by the scale of work that Katherine's just talked about, actually just being able to zero in and focus on what you can achieve and what will make a difference on your particular portfolio and asset, and being really targeted on that. I think that's a great way to kind of bite the chunk off the elephant that can seem so overwhelming. We talked about the driver that policy tools can make, and moving towards an environment of more consistent standards from the work that Stuart's doing within the government estate, but also that can be then used as best practice elsewhere is hugely valuable. I think understanding the level of commitment and work that needs to come into this, but actually that it has very much moved us from a policy-led compliance agenda through to kind of an investor-driven agenda. I think we can agree that the Edelman headline is somewhat misleading, and actually that we are not seeing any shortage. Even I think the COVID, if anything, has accelerated requests for more ESG evidence and data. But all those frameworks needing to harmonise is something really key. and that tech will play a role. So those are kind of my headline points. I'm going to come round and ask each of you for that kind of final commentary. So Stuart, to you first.
Yeah, I think we touched on it a couple of times during this, but I think for me, the key is just threading this and embedding this through all aspects of decision making in an organisation. Yeah, that's the brief summary.
Brilliant, thank you. Katherine.
Yeah, I would agree. Fully ESG integration includes, everything from investment process, due diligence, asset management, reporting, disclosure. It's fully integrated. I suppose 3 areas, I think I've harped on about them enough over the course of the webinar, is reporting, but smart, standardized reporting, I think is increasingly important. That transparency piece is key. Linked to that, sector-wide data consistency, and again, folding social considerations into that as well. But then also pricing, and I do think we're not accurately pricing in ESG risk as well as ESG opportunity, and I would love to see that shift over the next few years.
Brilliant, thank you, Jon.
Well, the first thing would be to say we need to stamp on the sort of misleading headlines that we've already referred to from the likes of Edelman, because I think it's just a nonsense. Probably a debate to continue offline, but there we go. I would the Prime Minister got a 10-point plan. Why can't I have one too? But I'll get my top 3 at the moment would be.
I haven't got all day.
I know. Get the D&I agenda sorted. From that, all other things will essentially follow. Education in the market generally, from undergrad, postgrad, and then through the professional market, needs to be absolutely prioritised, and perhaps watch this space a little bit on that. And then back to my point around the alignment of purpose and objectives throughout the value chain, using non-financial rewards and incentives and penalties, in balance to align everyone properly to address this huge issue we have around the fragmentation of roles and responsibilities across the market, would be my third.
Super, thank you. And I think the point is, I can see the level of engagement on the chat and on the questions is huge. We've had a really engagement. I'm sorry we didn't get to all of the questions and the level of detail, but I think we need a whole day with these fantastic experts and not just an hour. But the session has been recorded. We're going to try and distill as much of this as we can into maybe further material. We'll take back to our working group and see if there are other points and maybe other sessions we can run in the future. But for now, thank you, Stuart, Katherine, and Jon, for sharing your insight and expertise. It's been enormously valuable and relating, and I feel inspired that we can all carry on fighting the good fight, that this is core, not discretionary, and actually something that we can achieve meaningful change around this. So thank you for your leadership in that.